Bear with me. Okay, beautiful. We're up on Facebook, we're up on Zoom. We are good to start. I want to welcome everyone. I don't know, is Nina, do we know, is Hansi on?
Yeah, here's her number, 7178. She's on the phone.
Okay, terrific. So again, it's always a pleasure to share our virtual hostess, Hansi Butler. Unfortunately, there's no mandelbrot and no coffee, and none of the things that those of us who are used to this year see as core parts of the experience. Even though I am perpetually dieting and trying to stay off the mazonos, but it is certainly wonderful to welcome Hansi. And again, we hope for the day when we will, again, there's something beautiful about the fact that we now have kind of expanded our reach in terms of who's learning together, but it would be very nice to be able to do that from Hansi's dining room table, as opposed to from this faux PZ-based measures background with a little picture of me standing in the back of the room, which creates a paradox that could destroy the universe. So we have to be very careful with things of that sort. Okay. I want to welcome you for the first of a multi-part series on a fascinating figure in Jewish history that I have wanted to address, find a venue for addressing for a long time, and lucky you guys are it. The saga of Shabbetai Tzvi, a figure who lived in the 15th century in the Ottoman Empire, in actually various places in the Ottoman Empire. And again, I would just remind people, I'm happy to take questions, but if you could please mute yourselves, just because again, it creates static for everybody else. That Shabbetai Tzvi was a figure who quite literally changed Jewish history. A mysterious figure, a fascinating figure, a brilliant and charismatic figure, quite likely, although again, long distance diagnosis is a dangerous thing, generally assumed today to have been a mentally ill person as well. But the Shabbetai Tzvi, for a period of a couple of years, caught up what is in all probability the majority, some might say the vast majority, of the Jewish world, including preeminent Talmidei Chachamim, great sages, some of whose works are part of the canon to this day. For a couple of years, we're all completely convinced that this person was in fact Mashiach ben David, was in fact the promised Messianic king. Right? This is world news. There were bets placed on the London Stock Exchange about whether or not Shabbetai Tzvi was indeed the Messiah. There were economic consequences to this. There were Jews in Germany, and again, we'll get to all of this eventually, who sold off property in the hopes that they were imminently about to move to Eretz Yisrael, and that there were people who were financially ruined by those events. And then to the absolute shock and pain of the Jewish world, in 1666, he converts to Islam, which again, one would have imagined should have brought his messianic career to a grinding halt. And the truth is, in many Jewish communities, there was a certain amount of denial about the fact that this episode ever happened, right? Let's never speak of this again, right? Burn the records, pretend that it didn't happen. There's actually a Rabbi Chaim Sabato, for those of you who are read his literature, whether in Hebrew or translation. Those of you who have not found Rabbi Chaim Sabato, who are into literature, should. He is, some of you in this group might remember when we did that book of the conversations with Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. Chaim Sabato, Rav Chaim Sabato, properly, is a Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshivat Birkat Moshe in Ma'ale Adumim, one of the premier Hesder yeshivas in Israel. And Rav Sabato is, in addition to being a Rosh Yeshiva, is actually a novelist. Has written a number of really wonderful novels. Those of you who are connoisseurs of such things, there are those who have compared his style to that of Agnon. And he has a whole short story involving an ancestor of his who was in a whole fight in the 18th century, again, more than 100 years after the time of Shabbetai Tzvi, right, where there was a huge rift in the community about the after effects of Shabbetai Tzvi, right? Shabbetai Tzvi's legacy for more than a century after his death ripped apart the Jewish world, right? That this was, and we'll eventually get to this, what is perhaps the one of the most painful rifts in 18th century Europe, one that pitted among the greatest Gedolei Yisrael of the really of the last few hundred years against each other, right? Was over the question of, and we'll all get to this in the right time, that in the 18th century that there was a significant rumor and a battle really over the question of whether Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshutz, who was, if you had to put the top 5 rabbis as courses that is of the 18th century, right, and rank them, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshutz would certainly be on this list. And yet there was a credible accusation, whether it was true or not, we're not going to figure out, but we'll discuss. There was a credible accusation that he was a follower of Shabbetai Tzvi after his apostasy and after his death, right? That he continued to affirm that this man who did in fact convert to Christianity, to Islam, was in fact Mashiach. And you essentially had a very painful civil war in the Jewish world. And the question is, what was it about this man that was so incredibly powerful and riveting? Now, again, Jerry Parness, who I see on the screen here, has mentioned, I think on Facebook, the person who is probably the most important academic figure in the study of Shabbetai Tzvi, although there's been a lot of work since his death as well, was Professor Gershom Shalom of the Hebrew University. So Gershom Shalom wrote a massive book on Shabbetai Tzvi, which again, like most fields, right, the seminal book gets critiqued, gets updated, gets attacked, gets qualified. Right? It's hard to get away from it, right? And that's the beginning of formal Sabbatian studies. So it happens to be, I was in Israel in January, right? Back when you just got in the plane and then you're in Israel, it's unbelievable, right? So I happen to have, I have in certain ways, a very narrow or very specific circle of friends in Israel. And I kind of assume based on them that most people in Israel spend a lot of their time in the National Library in Jerusalem. This may not be true of all people in Israel, but certainly amongst the people that I hang out with, there seems to be an unusual percentage of them who do. So I got to spend for the first time in my life a really amazing day in the National Library in Jerusalem, which includes all of Gershom Shalom's private library is in the National Library. There's a special Gershom Shalom library that's mostly books of Kabbalah and things related to the things that he was studying. So I spent about 90 minutes just pulling things off the shelf, looking at them. I found a very bizarre book, a kind of conspiracy theory kind of book that sees Shabbetai Tzvi as responsible, as kind of the core of everything that happened, including the, what do you call it? The tripartite committee and like all these, the various kinds of things conspiracy theorists believe in. And in Gershom Shalom's handwriting on the front page, he wrote nonsense based on me, underlined, right, in the front page, right? So the idea that this person, right, continues to reverberate throughout Jewish history, again, as we will see as we go on, part of the background of the tension over the beginning of the Hasidic movement, right, was of the fear that this was some kind of kind of rebirth of the Shabbetai Tzvi movement. And it's interesting that there are things that come, and again, it's debatable how much, but there are all kinds of things, even things that we do to this day, right, that somehow are responsible for, are somehow linked to Shabbetai Tzvi and his followers, right? The Sephardic community in Holland, their pattern of when they duchen, right, goes back to Shabbetai Tzvi, right? The practice of both the recitation of David Hashem Ori during Elul, as well as the so-called Tu B'Shvat Seder, right, are both possibly, right, come from the circles of Shabbetai Tzvi, right? There are some classic Hasidic Vartlach, which again, it goes from one to one to one to one, right? But there's a very beautiful piece in the Bnei Yissaschar about Tisha B'Av that I've been teaching for 25 years now, right? And that there's indication that the earliest source for this Vart about Tisha B'Av comes from the followers of Shabbetai Tzvi, right? So it's not just a question of a particular dramatic moment, right? But it's something that has, right, goes in a lot of different directions. Again, I hope that my excitement about this will be contagious enough to keep you with me for a few weeks of exploring through this really fascinating topic. And we'll see that there are some contemporary, even today, that the story is not an irrelevant story. So I'll say one thing and then we'll move into what I want to do today, which is actually the background to the issue of false messianism. But that I will credit, I just feel like I need to, that my fascination with Shabbetai Tzvi began probably, I think it was 10 or 11 years old. So there's a fellow in Lakewood who writes under the pen name of Avner Gold. Right, so he wrote a series of children's books set in Jewish history. The 5th volume of the series is called The Imposter. And it is a book about Shabbetai Tzvi. And basically I was hooked from that point, right? Later, when I was a little bit later, I don't know, 15, 16, I delved into Gershom Shalom's book and saw where everything that Avner Gold cribbed came from originally, right? But the story itself is beyond compelling. But what we need to start with today, and this is really our agenda, is to examine the question of messianism and false messianism in general. And what I'd like to do is do that by focusing on 2 texts from the Rambam. So I'm going to put the text up on the screen. Give me a second here. Okay. The first text, so the belief in Mashiach, right, is, as the Rambam himself wrote, an Ikar Amuna, right? It is one of the core dogmas of Judaism. And certainly in the words of the Nevi'im are filled, right, with this idea. Although again, it's interesting, the what it's all about is one of the things we're going to talk about today, but the idea that there will be a redemption and a redeemer, right? That certainly the idea that there's an end to history is something that we find explicitly in Chumash and implicitly as well in Chumash, right? The idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will eventually restore the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael, that there will be a time of blessing that will follow. And it is, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth as we go forward today, is also something that was really a lifeline to Jews in situations of crisis. Now, it's interesting. I don't know if people, I put this on Facebook. I also sent out one of these reading lists I was sending out for Yantiv. There's an article in Mishpacha about 2 weeks ago by Rav Aaron Lopiansky Shlita, the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva in Silver Spring, who's really one of the first-rate thinkers in the Jewish world today, talking about misconceptions about Mashiach. If you haven't read the article, it is well worth reading. And he is skeptical of the rush that people certainly feel, right, and the kind of catastrophic thinking, right? Let's say in this period, it must be that what's going on today is Mashiach. Right? It couldn't be anything else to have. There's never been a plague over the whole world. And he points out that a knowledge of history dumps some cold water on that kind of thinking. But the truth is, in many ways, it's a very natural kind of response, right? The idea that what people are looking for is hope, right? The idea of Mashiach at the core, right, is about, right, Geula is about hope. The idea of Techias HaMesim, the revival of the dead, is about hope. You look at the way that the prophet Yechezkel talks about it, that it's the antidote to those who say, Avda Sikvasenu, that our hope is lost. And again, even within the world of Jewish history, that I think that it is eminently defensible that the whole return of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael in the last century and a half, right, very much was a reframing of the Messianic belief. In other words, had Jews not hung on for 2,000 years or 1,800 years to that belief, right? And again, that certainly in terms of the first Ashkenazi Jews to return to Eretz Yisrael in the 18th century, the followers of the Vilna Gaon, right? It's very clear that they came with ideas about Mashiach. They literally thought they were going to establish, to pave the way for Mashiach. At the same time, though, like many good things, right, there is a potential dark side. That's where we are going to start today. So I want to share with you a couple of passages from a fascinating letter called the Igeres Teiman, right, the letter to Yemen, right? And it is one of the many gifts that were left to us by the Rambam, Rav Moshe ben Maimon. So Yemen, right? So the Rambam, at the point that he wrote the letter, lived in Egypt. He was in a very potentially politically powerful position because he was the Sultan, he was the physician to the harem of the Sultan of Egypt, right? Now, again, if you are a medieval Islamic ruler, your harem is something that's very important to you, right? You want someone to keep your wives very healthy, right? And that is what the Rambam did. We actually have fascinating other writings of the Rambam that talked about his exhausting schedule, right? That he was really somebody who was, he had to go and he had to ride out to where the harem was and hear about everybody's headaches and everybody's issues and so forth. And it was only then, at the end of the whole day of working in the harem, and he rode his donkey back to Fustat, to his home, that's when he started being the Rambam, right? Which included everybody who had their medical questions, who needed to ask him, a shaila in medicine, and all of the work in halacha and in learning and philosophy, right? And basically he said he was completely exhausted all the time. It's a remarkable piece of humanity. Anyways, the Jews of Yemen in the time of the Rambam, right, who again are also part of the Islamic world, the Jews of Yemen are faced with a number of crises, right? One is a crisis of that there is a move to force them to convert to Islam, and that they're actually Jewish apostates who are working with this movement, trying to make the argument that really somehow, like kind of the Jews for Jesus kind of thing, right? That somehow the Torah really is pro-Islam, right? And the community was basically in tremendous crisis. They were in financial crisis, and they also were that there was a Messiah, a false Messiah, a claimant to being Mashiach, and basically the community leadership was losing their mind. They had no idea, how do we deal with all these fronts? So somebody said, let's write to the Rambam. And the Rambam wrote them back, right? And the Rambam also got involved using his political clout to help the Jews of Yemen, to save them from a destructive kind of tax. And that left a tremendous relationship between Yemenite Jewry and the Rambam. And the truth is, to this day, I see, looking at the sheets, we even have mothers of Yemenites with us on the call, right? That in the Yemenite halachic tradition, the Rambam looms much larger than he does to anyone else. Again, Yemen is a complicated place, but certainly one of the primary halachic traditions in Yemen is in Yemen you paskin like the Rambam, right? And that they hold very much, they saw the Rambam as a leader to a degree that the Ramban, if you take a look at, I have in the page here, right? That the Ramban, who the Rambam was somewhat controversial. We'll talk about one of the reasons he was controversial in a moment, right? That the Ramban wrote a letter to the rabbis in France, right? The Ramban lives about a century after the Rambam. The Rambam continues to be controversial, particularly in France. There was a whole movement against the Rambam. Maybe we'll learn about that some other time, right? And the Ramban, who lived in Catalonia, right, in northern Christian Spain, writes them a letter saying, you don't know what you're getting yourself into. Don't start up with the Rambam. And he says, because you're taking on also all the Jews in Yemen. So listen to this. I now attest for myself in the presence of my rabbis, heaven and earth, that in all the lands of the kingdom of Yemen, in many communities occupied with the study of Torah and the fulfillment of the mitzvahs, right? All these wonderful, religious, observant, pious Yemenite Jews, listen to that, it's unbelievable. They mention the name of the Rambam in every Kaddish, right? That when they say, right, the beginning of Kaddish, right? I have to remember, it's been a little bit, right? That we ask God, right? That God should establish His kingdom. Right? So we say in your lifetime and in your days. And in Yemen they would say right? That God, that they and again, we don't know the background of this particular, right? So the Ramban preserved this little piece of trivia for us, but that gives you a sense, right? And there's like that they messed with the text of Kaddish because that's how important they saw the Rambam was. And that's part of the background of this letter. So here's the letter. It was written originally in Arabic. This is the text of the epistle of Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, Rabbi and Dayan, in reply to a letter of Rabbi Yaakov of Yemen. And he says, okay, and he explains the problem. You write that the rebel leader in Yemen decried compulsory apostasy for the Jews by forcing the Jewish inhabitants of all the places he'd subdued to desert the Jewish religion, right? So that's one of the crises. That's not really our issue. So one of the things that he talks about, right, is a really interesting topic, which is the question of, can you calculate when Mashiach is going to come, right? Now, and really the core text for this is the book of Daniel, right? Now, the book of Daniel, which it's interesting, I think we had talked about at some point before this all happened, we were talking about maybe learning Daniel in this year. So maybe when we finish Shabbetai, maybe we'll take up Daniel, who knows, right? So Daniel is a very unusual book. The first half of first of all, it's written in 2 languages, which is already strange. The first half of Daniel has a lot of stories, right? The famous stories about the men that were thrown into the Kivshan Aish, into the fiery furnace, right? Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. There's the story when Daniel was thrown into a lion's den, right? Very nice, dramatic stories. The end of Daniel, right, is really very mysterious. It's all kinds of very kind of graphic, hallucinogenic almost visions about what's going to come in the future, right? And it's very mysterious, and nobody knows exactly what it means, right? There are all kinds of theories, and so Daniel, in many ways, sums up the tension over the issue of messianic calculations, right? Because the book of Daniel actually gives numbers of when Mashiach or various events connected to Mashiach are going to come, right? So, for instance, I'm looking here at the end. He says at the very end, it says something about that there's going to be some part of the messianic process is going to take 1,290 days. Now, again, does days mean years? When do the days start? What happens at the end of the days, right? But if you are at a place where you really want to know when Mashiach is coming, not just because, it's like, I don't know, conversation at a cocktail party, right? But you really feel like your life is miserable, right? The state of Klal Yisrael is in existential danger, right? And you have a book here in the Tanakh that gives you the information. Here's another, again, the next pasuk here. Ashrei ha'mechake v'yagia, happy is the one who waits and arrives. Liyamim elef shloshmeo shlosha v'chamisha, right? Who comes to 1,335 days, right? Now, 1,335 days of what? 1290, 1335. What do they start from? When do they end from? Days, years. What is it talking about? It doesn't really know. In fact, Daniel himself, and again, it's all about what you quote, right? So Daniel also says, and this is what the Rambam starts with here. Daniel says in that same section, he says, "Sesumim v'chasumim advarim ad eis kates," right? The words are shut up and sealed, right? And the Rambam's message is basically stay away. He says, now, again, it obviously is in many ways very tempting, right? Everybody wants to do this, right? Can we find out when Mashiach is going to come, right? And he says that there's actually a pasuk that this is going to happen. And the Rambam's very strong advice that he gives is don't play with this, right? So again, what do you see? They only give warnings about things that are tempting, right? And you don't warn people, I don't know, don't eat your shoes, right? Nobody's not going to eat their shoes, right? Unless you're talking to toddlers, in which case, of course, you should tell them not to eat their shoes, right? But under normal circumstances, you don't have to warn about things that people aren't interested in doing. But the temptation to try to calculate when Mashiach is going to come, there's a fascinating book which I've referred to in a copy here. I think my copy is at home, but it doesn't matter. There's a book, really a wonderful book that was written based on various documents that were hidden in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the guy his name was Shimon Huberbrand, he was a Hasidic rabbi and also a historian, very interesting personality. He wrote down all kinds of stuff, like the jokes from the Warsaw Ghetto. And it was like, people told jokes in the Warsaw Ghetto. What were their jokes about? Really fascinating. He has a whole chapter about the various rumors about when Mashiach was going to come, right? Based on either, if you take the gematria of this pasuk, and the truth is, I remember I was in high school during the first Gulf War in 1991. And I remember there were all kinds of things going around at that time. For most of us, we look back at the Gulf War today, right? And those of us who remember those events, right? We certainly remember it, but it was, another, notch on the timeline, right? But as it was going on, it was super scary. What was what was unfolding in Eretz Yisrael and so forth. And I remember, I have these very strong memories of, if you take the pasuk in the Shira, right? What is it? It's the pasuk says, it's 5 olives, right? Amar Oyev Erdof Asiga Chalik Shalal. So 5 olives is 5,000. Who paskin this? I don't know. So in the year 5,000, right? Achalek. How did this go? I forgot. Achalek. I'm sorry. Achalek Shalal. What's the rest of the pasuk? Okay, that's what it was, right? Achalek Shalal Timlaemo Nafshi, right? The first letters are Aleph, Shin, Taf, Nun. That's Taf, Shin, Nun, Aleph, the year 1991 when it was happening, right? Arik, right, is the same word as Iraq, okay? And Charbi was Rashi Tevos, is an acronym for Hussein Russia Bush Yinatzeach, right? That Saddam Hussein is wicked, and Bush will be correct, will win, which actually, interestingly enough, actually happened twice. That 2 Bushes beat Saddam Hussein, but that's a separate story. But the point is that there is something very, very tempting about doing that, right? And the Rambam says, don't do it, right? And again, if you want to understand the atmosphere that creates the possibility for a false Messiah, right, you have to think about a world where people are thinking this way, right? Can we find a way of happening? And the Rambam makes the point that even how long the Jews were going to be in Egypt, right, back in the day wasn't clear, right? They had a clear prophecy to Abraham, right, that your descendants will be in a foreign land for 400 years. But when does the 400 years begin? When does it begin? What does it end? What does it mean? Right? It's all not clear, right? And he says, inasmuch as Daniel proclaimed the matter a great secret, our sages have interdicted means have forbidden the calculation of the time of the future redemption, or the reckoning of the period of the advent of the Messiah, because the masses might be mystified and bewildered should the Messiah fail to appear as forecast. And this, of course, is the great danger, right? That if you make the hope, right, it's going to happen one day. Will it be in my life? Is it going to be my great-grandchildren's life? Nobody knows, right? Nobody knows the answer to that question, right? So on the one hand, it's tempting to say, let's calculate it, right? But he says the calculations are, in the end of the day, a stumbling block, right? And the advice he's giving the Jews of Yemen is, don't sweat this stuff, right? This is not something that you should be involved in. The great Rav Saadia Gaon, did in fact record his own calculations. And he said, and again, listen to the way he puts it, there are extenuating circumstances for them, though he knew they were disallowed. For the Jews of his time were perplexed and misguided. The divine religion might have disappeared had he not encouraged a knowledge of its underlying principles. He believed in all earnestness that by the means of messianic calculation, he would inspire, a word got left out, he would inspire the people, right? So the Rambam admits, right, and the tension is already there in Sefer Daniel, right? Some of the raw data, quote unquote, is there to work with, right? And that the concreteness of those numbers, even if it's kind of ephemeral, if we don't know how to plug them in, right, helps make this dream real, right? Helps us really think about it. At the same time, it is very, very dangerous that this is going to be the case. Now, he says basically, in the end of the day, what's important for you to believe, right? Affirm your faith in the expected one, right? Remember that we have don't give up, right? But HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to save us. Now, I want to show you though, right? So the Rambam here is the great defender of you can't calculate when Mashiach's going to come. But you read a few pages later in the letter and you find something unbelievable. I am in possession of an extraordinary tradition which I received from my father, who in turn received it from his father, going back to our ancestors who were exiled from Jerusalem. The Rambam says, right, so again, this is not a class on medieval Sephardi Jewry. Medieval Sephardi Jewry, very clearly, you see this in a lot of places. Barbanel writes about this in his introduction to his commentary on Chumash, were possessed of a very strong tradition that they were the descendants of Jews exiled from Yerushalayim, and that they were the aristocracy of the Jewish people, right? And he goes through, he says that we have this Masorah in our family. He says that, and he goes through how you get to it. He says that prophecy will be restored to the Jewish people in the year 4970, right? Which is 1209, 1210, right? Now, the Rambam, this letter was written in the 1170s, right? And the Rambam actually dies in, I think, in 1204, right? So the Rambam didn't make it to 1209, 1210, right? But in other words, it's a, for the Rambam's purposes here, it was a helpful calculation, right? Because it takes it off the table for now, right? And it's something that is predicted for some point in the future. But the point that I make is the tension between, I would call, the passive belief that Mashiach will come at some point, right? And what I would call messianic activism, trying to make it happen more quickly, believing that it's going to happen, looking for calculations, looking for the figure who is going to be Mashiach, right, is something that exists even within the Rambam himself. That's point number one. Point number two is the Rambam mentions, and it's fascinating, he preserves the memory of the fact most of us can name, I would say, very few false messiahs. And those, many of you may have heard of Shabbetai Tzvi. I hope maybe that's what encouraged many of you have come out today, right? Nobody knows, for the most part, you might have heard of Bar Kokhba, certainly Jesus, a famous false messiah, right? But there actually have been many, many false messiahs, right? So the Rambam is writing to his people. You mentioned that a certain man in one of the cities of Yemen pretends that he is the Messiah. As I live, I am not surprised at him or his followers, for I have no doubt that he is mad. And a sick person should not be rebuked or reproved for an illness brought on by no fault of his own. Neither am I surprised at his votaries, for they were persuaded because of their sorry plight, their ignorance of the importance and high rank of Mashiach, and their mistaken comparison of the Messiah with the son of the Mahdi, the belief in whose rise they are witnessing. Right? There is in Lahavdil, in the Muslim tradition, they have a messianic figure called the Mahdi, and that his suggestion is, if you live in a messianically inflamed society, you start to think that way. But he says that basically, why are you taking this guy seriously at all? He's a nothing. He doesn't know anything. Mashiach is going to be a great prophet. Mashiach is going to be a great Talmid Chacham, and so on and so forth. And he goes on, that we're going to know who Mashiach is. It's not going to be somebody like this. He says also, and it's interesting, this is the only place the Rambam says this, Mashiach is going to present himself in Eretz Yisrael. And interestingly, and this is the whole question why he says this, right? The Rambam here says, right, that he will prove by means of miracles and wonders that he is the true Messiah. Now it's interesting, the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah contradicts this. And the Rambam says Mashiach doesn't have to do any miracles, right? But there's a practical reason perhaps why the Rambam says this here, is because it's another way of trying to push this guy out of the way. In other words, and we'll end in a little bit with that point, right? That the more, I'll come back to that point. Okay, but what I wanted to show you here, right, is, again, and his diagnosis here, in my opinion, is most advisable, both for your good and for his, that you put him in iron chains for a while until the Gentiles learn that he is demented. After you have blazoned and brooded about the intelligence concerning the man, you may then release him without endangering his safety. And basically take things into your own hands, he says, because if you procrastinate until they learn of this affair of their own accord, then you will most likely incur their wrath. And again, one of the interesting subtexts when we come to the career of Shabbetai Tzvi himself, right, was the questions of how the rabbinic authorities who did not believe in him in the communities that presented themselves, how do they deal with that situation, right? Which is a political question. It's a very complicated political question. The last thing that I want to show you from this letter, which is important, is the Rambam tells a number of different stories, right? He talks about the idea, he says that there were hundreds of thousands of Jews in Persia, led by an individual who pretended to be Mashiach, right? Who actually started a military campaign. And again, we would not know about this episode, right? It happened a few hundred years before the Rambam in the times of Umayyads, right? But the Rambam tells us there was actually a messianic battle in Persia. It says the Rambam says, from my understanding, it was all the way to the time, all the way to Baghdad, right? And there's the Baghdad was under siege by this false Messiah, right? And he goes through a whole, so on and so forth. And he says a number of stories. He says in Spain, there was a man by the name of Moshe al-Dari, right? Moshe al-Dari was a student of Rabbi Yosef Halevi ibn Migash, right? We know this rabbi, great rabbi, is the Migash. He was the Rebbe of the Rambam's father, right? The Rambam's father was Rabbeinu Maimon Adayan. Rabbeinu Maimon Adayan learned by the Migash, and we still in yeshivas today, right? There are certain masechtos where you have the Migash on the table with you, right? A very important rishon. So this is a student of the Migash, and this fellow, right, the student of the Migash, right? He did not pretend, as did the former lunatic, that he was the Messiah. He just said that the Messiah had appeared. My father and my master endeavored to dissuade and discourage people from following him. However, only a few were influenced by my father, while most, nay, nearly all, clung to Rabbi Moses of blessed memory. And he goes through this whole story. He was able to do all kinds of wondrous kinds of things, right? And again, listen to this. When the majority of people, boldness, put their trust in him, he predicted the Messiah would come that year on Erev Pesach. And he said, everybody should sell your property, right? Borrow money. It's going to be great because you're never going to, and again, the ethics of this is a separate question, right? Borrow money because, right, comes Pesach here in Eretz Yisrael, you'll never have to pay off the debts, right? Of course, it didn't actually happen. The people were ruined and they were overwhelmed by death, right? And that he basically had to run away from Spain because it was dangerous. And he tells them another story that 20 years before that, there was another story, right? A man by the name of Ibn Aryeh, right? And they believed Ibn Aryeh was Mashiach. And then 40 years before that in France, in what probably the city of Lyon, there was somebody who was able to fake various kinds of miracles. He would fly from tree to treetop, right? And again, the same thing happened, and eventually the French executed. So the point that I want to make from you from this letter from the Rambam is that this has been a perennial problem in Jewish history, right? And the balancing those things, right? The mitzvah of tzipiyah Yeshua, right? Of yearning for salvation, right? Together with having to be careful, right? About not buying, a false a false bill of goods, right? That's a very complicated thing. And it is relatively easy to fall into that kind of trap. Okay, so what I want to show you, the last thing, the Rambam in the Laws of Kings, the last section of the Mishnah Torah, goes through a real tour de force of trying to work out what Mashiach is all about. And one of the things that the Rambam maintains is, do not presume that in the Messianic age, any facet of the world's nature will change or there will be innovations in creation. Rather, the world will continue according to its pattern. Right? Now, this is a matter of great debate, right? And so, for instance, the Ravid, the Ramban very much disagree with him on this point. The Rambam believes that the time of Mashiach will be, from, let's call it the perspective of the natural order, will be no different than the world that we are familiar with. Right? It's not going to be a time, there aren't going to be, miracles, there aren't going to be wonders, right? The whole idea of Tchias HaMesim, which the Rambam does not talk a lot about, is going to happen somewhere in the distant future, right? That it's going to be a world very similar to our own world, right? And he makes the point here, very strongly, that everything that we find in earlier sources, right? So, for instance, the famous prophecy of Yeshaya, the wolf will dwell with the lamb. He says these words are a metaphor and a parable, right? Animals are going to continue to be animals. I think I've told this story at some point recently. That at the old biblical zoo, right before Malcha, when it was still up in, they used to have, the story is, I don't know if it's true, they used to have an exhibit where they had a cage with a wolf and a lamb in the cage together. They had the pasuk from Yeshaya on the cage, and somebody commented to the zookeeper, like, it's amazing that you're able to do this. He's like, yeah, we go through a lot of lambs, right? That's the Rambam says that's what the zoo is going to look like when Mashiach comes also. So the Ravid says it can't be. Right, and that there is a within the world of Jewish Messianic thought, you have these two approaches. One approach of what I would call, for lack of a better term, the more rationalistic approach, right? The Yemos HaMashiach is going to be a time, it'll be a time of peace, it'll be a time of prosperity, it'll be a time that affords people the presence of mind to be involved with the pursuit of Torah and of wisdom, right? And that, again, one of the things, and this to me is very compelling, the Rambam says that in the end of the day, right, and he comes back to this idea in a number of different ways. When Mashiach comes, we'll figure out what these things mean, right? And there's spending the time now, right, trying to work out the details is a waste of time, right? We don't know how the prophecies are going to play themselves out. We don't know exactly what this is all about. We believe what's important is, and again, I think I have the, he says in the end, neither the order of the occurrence of these events or their precise details are among the fundamental principles of faith, right? You shouldn't over-focus on these ideas, right? You should wait and believe in the general conception of the matter. That's the approach of the Rambam. Now, my teacher, Rabbi Dr. David Berger, made a fascinating point. And that the irony is that the Rambam's rationalistic conception of what Yemos HaMashiach is going to look like actually makes false messianism more possible, right? Because again, if your assumption of what Mashiach has to do, right, is that Mashiach has to be able to get, cows and lions to live together, right? That's a pretty, again, unless you have an unending store of cows, right? That's a difficult thing to do. But if Mashiach does not have to do any miracles, right? And that's what I meant before in the Igeres Teman. In the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam says, let me see if I have it explicitly over here. The Rambam very clearly believes, it might have been the parak beforehand, Mashiach does not need to do any miracles, right? Which again, may well be correct, right? But if he doesn't have to do miracles, if I'm going to pretend to be Mashiach, it's not so difficult, right? And he has this fascinating quote here, right? That for the Sabbateans, the followers of Shabbetai Tzvi, he quotes this passage from Nathan of Gaza. Right? Nathan of Gaza, Nassan Azasi, was the prophet of Shabbetai Tzvi. We're going to have a lot more to say about Nathan of Gaza. But he says, even though we have found no hint of this matter in the explicit words of the Torah, we have already seen how strange the sages' words are regarding these matters, that we cannot fully understand them, as the great luminary Maimonides has also testified. In other words, Nathan of Gaza says, yeah, it's a little bit strange the guy converted to Islam. I didn't see that coming. Right, but we already know from the Rambam that we don't understand anything about Yemos HaMashiach. So yeah, it could be that really this was prophesied beforehand, right? And again, that he refers to this, and I think that he is correct, as a sharp and highly significant irony, right? And again, that we will keep that in mind in terms of exploring Shabbetai Tzvi. The last issue, which we're not going to get to today, but we'll start with next week, is as we try to drill down and understand the classical conceptions of what Mashiach is supposed to do. The question of what is going to be the role of the Torah, right, and of doing mitzvos during Yemos HaMashiach, right? And there, the paradox is a little bit different. The more that you think the world is going to change when Mashiach comes, in other words, the more miraculous, the more otherworldly the Messianic world is, that raises another question, right, which again, in certain ways was already an issue to some degree in Christianity, is will the Torah still be relevant? In other words, is a Messianic world a world that's going to demand a new Torah, right? And we'll spend a little bit of time on the background of that question, which again is something that there are classical sources that there's a lot of fire over this particular issue. But one of the things that we'll see, and as a little bit of a teaser, right, that Shabbetai Tzvi, part of what he did particular for his inner circle, is he would tell them to violate prohibitions in the Torah, and in fact, to make a bracha before doing so, right? So some of you may be familiar, hopefully we're familiar, the bracha we say in the morning, right? The HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Matir Asurim, that God loosens those who are bound up, in other words, that we're laying in bed, and then we, bound out of bed and stretch our arms and legs and so forth. So Shabbetai Tzvi invented a bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Matir Isurim, right? God who permits that which is forbidden. And he would literally have his followers perform averos in the Torah, perform things that are strictly forbidden. First, make a bracha. Thank you, Hashem, for permitting that which is forbidden. And that, as perverse as that is, right? There's a reason why that appealed, and we'll try to work that material out next week, and then work our way into the very strange story of the career of Shabbetai Tzvi. So we'll stop for now. I'm going to turn off the screen share. We'll take a moment. Any questions on anything we talked about today? If you want to unmute themselves, I'm happy to take questions for a couple of minutes, and then we'll regroup for next week.
Thank you. Fascinating.
You are
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for taking us down this road. I didn't expect it.
Oh, you have no idea where we're going. No. I actually will have an announcement of my own to make at the end. I'm just kidding. But I'm a lady. out of the game. All right.
I didn't expect that. That was good. Okay.
Chumash tomorrow morning and Parsha tomorrow night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.